Argentina is facing elections in October and November of this year, 2019. There are two major forces in Argentine politics at the moment. On the one hand, you have President Mauricio Macri, who's seeking re-election. On the other hand, at the other end of the political spectrum, you have Kirchnerismo. And the candidate for Kirchnerismo, the left-wing movement named after the former president Néstor Kirchner, is Alberto Fernández, and his running mate is the former president and Néstor Kirchner's wife, Cristina Fernández. No relation between the two Fernández, although it's clear that Cristina Fernández wields the real power in this relationship. Currently, the polls put the Fernández duo in the lead, but only slightly above the President Mauricio Macri. Fernández is on around the late 30s percentage-wise, with Macri following up behind in the low 30s, and then the moderate Peronists on around 10%. It looks like we're heading for a second round because no one has the votes to avoid that runoff vote this year. All of the parties have already decided who their candidates are going to be, so there is no need for a primary, but the primary should still take place. And as voting is compulsory, turnout usually is around about 80%. So the most market-friendly candidate is undoubtedly Mauricio Macri. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the Fernández candidacy. The IMF is invested heavily in Macri's re-election. The Kirchneristas are kind of playing their cards fairly close to their chest. I think it's wrong to assume that they would immediately or automatically default on the IMF should they win the presidency. The economy is the main factor that is driving voting intentions. Inflation has proved stubbornly high, and unemployment is also very high at over 10% in the first quarter of 2019, and we've seen over 4 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Something that's important to remember in this whole Argentine political story is the importance that Buenos Aires province plays in the electoral system. My name is Nicholas Watson. I'm Managing Director for Latin America at Teneo. I head up our coverage of Spanish-speaking Latin America, specializing in the major markets of Latin America: Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, and so on. Argentina is facing elections in October and November of this year, 2019. It's a presidential election and also an election for half of the lower house of Congress and a third of the Senate. The first round of the presidential election takes place on the 27th of October. To avoid a runoff that would happen in late November, the winning candidate must secure 45% of the vote or get 40% of the vote with a 10-point advantage or margin over the second place candidate. If neither of those two scenarios works out, then a runoff vote between the top 2 candidates takes place on the 24th of November. Prior to the vote in October-November, there is a compulsory primary vote that takes place on the 11th of August. This is a peculiarity of the Argentine political system in that the primaries are compulsory and they're open to the whole electorate, so not just party members or affiliates. So what these primaries end up being is a kind of a huge and quite expensive public opinion poll ahead of the first round. Okay. So there are 9 presidential tickets aiming to compete in the August primary votes. The purpose of the primary is to sort out who is going to represent each grouping or coalition. The oddity of the system is that in this year, all of the parties have already decided who their candidates are going to be. So there is no need for a primary, but the primary should still take place. There is a move afoot currently to cancel the whole primary process. But as things stand, those primaries will go ahead. And as voting is compulsory, turnout usually is around about 80%, these primary votes end up working as a kind of pre-first round vote prior to the actual vote that takes place in October. Of course, there's some tactical voting that takes place in the primaries. And of course, the primaries can shape the voting that comes later in October. So if one party or coalition is looking particularly strong, other voters may flock to another grouping when October comes round. So they're not a completely accurate picture of the state of the race, but they provide an interesting snapshot of the electoral outlook. There are two major forces in Argentine politics at the moment. On the one hand, you have President Mauricio Macri, who's seeking re-election. And he, this time around, has allied with a moderate Peronist senator called Miguel Ángel Pichetto for his running mate. On the other hand, at the other end of the political spectrum, you have Kirchnerismo. And the candidate for Kirchnerismo, the left-wing movement named after the former president Nestor Kirchner, is Alberto Fernández, and his running mate is the former president and Nestor Kirchner's wife, Cristina Fernández. No relation between the two Fernández. So you have, on the one hand, the Macri-Pichetto ticket, and on the other, you have the Fernández ticket. And then there's a smaller third force of kind of moderate Peronists who don't really stand a chance of winning, but will be an important player in this very polarized race between these two major forces. To understand Argentine politics, you need to know about Peronism. Peronism is a force in Argentine politics that's been around since the 1940s, named after the former president Peron. And it's become a kind of catch-all party that has been the predominant party in the country's politics since the 1940s. The strange thing about Peronism is that it can be all things to all men. We've seen incarnations of Peronism that have been investor market friendly, and we've seen much more radical leftist incarnations of Peronism as well. So it really swings between different political movements, and at the moment Peronism is heavily divided between the more radical left-wing brand of Peronism espoused by Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the former president, and moderate Peronists who are more pragmatic and have been trying to break away from Cristina's grip on the party and on the movement. They have failed to come up with an alternative that relegates her, and she has not retired from public life since leaving the presidency. In fact, she became a senator and is still obviously hugely influential and will be on the presidential ticket in 2019. So Peronism is divided. That's been extremely functional for the government because a united Peronism would defeat Macri fairly easily. So Macri has fostered those divisions, and we've seen him bring on board a moderate Peronist onto his ticket precisely in order to keep that cleavage within Peronism alive. The outlook is still very open, and there's really everything to play for. Currently, the polls put the Fernández duo in the lead, but only slightly above the President Mauricio Macri. It appears likely that Fernández is on around the late 30s percentage-wise, with Macri following up behind in the low 30s, and then the moderate Peronists on around 10%. So at the moment, it looks like we're heading for a second round because no one has the votes to avoid that runoff vote. So the most market-friendly candidate is undoubtedly Mauricio Macri. He has pushed a investor market-friendly pivot, trying to quote-unquote normalize Argentina after years of economic heterodoxy and populist policies. And so his position is that he needs another 4 years to cement the process of change and to return Argentina to being a more quote-unquote normal country that is fully inserted into the global economy. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the Fernandez candidacy. Alberto Fernandez, who's the presidential candidate, although it's clear that Cristina Fernandez wields the real power in this relationship. Alberto Fernandez is seen as a slightly more accommodating, more pragmatic, slightly more moderate candidate than Cristina, which is why Cristina pushed him to be number one on the ticket. Alberto Fernandez broke with Cristina for around 10 years and was distant from her, and they had a falling out. And so over the last year, they rejoined forces, and she promoted him to be the candidate, knowing that the markets did not look upon her candidacy kindly at all. Her strength is also her weakness. Her strength is that she has a solid kind of third of the electorate that's behind her. The problem is that growing beyond that third is extremely difficult. So she has a high floor but a low ceiling. And the idea of the Alberto Fernandez candidacy is that it enables her to just push at that ceiling and push upwards. And then moderate Peronism is seen as kind of in between the two, not the populist brand of Peronism represented by Cristina, but not as market friendly or as investor friendly as Macri would be. The IMF is invested heavily in Macri's re-election for the sake of continuity, for the sake of the program that was agreed last year. The Macri IMF partnership is seen as the way ahead. Having said that, the Kirchnerista view on the IMF, well, the Kirchneristas are kind of playing their cards fairly close to their chest. I think it's wrong to assume that they would immediately or automatically default on the IMF should they win the presidency. And the idea, again, of the Alberto Fernandez candidacy is that it suggests a slightly more moderate stance. And they are positioning themselves more as a kind of reincarnation of the Nestor Kirchner years rather than the latter years of Cristina's presidency, which were much more radical. But clearly, if Cristina and Alberto Fernandez were to secure the presidency, there would be huge uncertainty and question marks over the future of the deal. And it's likely that they would look to renegotiate parts of that deal and extend it over time, perhaps, or possibly default.
Okay.
The economy is the main factor that is driving voting intentions. Macri promised an end to heterodoxy, the resumption of growth, more transparency, and inflows of foreign investment that would support the return to growth and a pivot to a more kind of rationally run economic model. And that's really failed to happen, and investment inflows simply haven't been on the scale that was promised. Inflation has proved much, much more difficult to tame than was expected. And of course, last year, Macri had to return to the IMF. So there's huge disappointment in Macri's handling of the economy. Inflation has proved stubbornly high, and unemployment is also very high at over 10% in the first quarter of 2019. And we've seen over 4 consecutive quarters of negative growth. That has helped boost Cristina Fernandez's chances, the economic outlook and a recovering economy is one of the main factors that would help Macri heading towards October. He's struggling, and he's had to bring in the IMF, which is anathema to most Argentines, given the very difficult past history between the country and the fund. And yet, he can't be written off. He made a smart move, allying with a moderate Peronist, cannibalizing that kind of center ground of Peronism. And remember, too, that he faces a very controversial candidate who has that low ceiling of support, who faces multiple investigations for corruption and is appearing in court during the campaign. This is all a major turnoff to many voters. So it remains the case, in my view, that despite his faults, despite his plunging popularity over the last 12 months, Macri does still stand a good, realistic chance of securing re-election, because at the end of the day, rejection of Cristina Fernandez and all that she stands for, and memories of how difficult her final administration was, still trump the declining popularity of Macri. It appears that Macri's poll ratings are recovering gradually, and that he is on something of an upward path. That probably reflects the end of the currency volatility that we saw in the March-April period of 2019. It also possibly reflects the signs, the tentative signs, that inflation is now on a downward path. And of course, his astute move to bring on board the moderate Peronist Pichetto to be his running mate. So we're seeing a slight recovery from Macri, and at the same time, Cristina appears to have reached a plateau. It's not clear that Alberto Fernandez, who will be her presidential candidate, really adds that much more in terms of numbers. And she has also attracted over another moderate Peronist, Sergio Massa, who came third in the 2015 presidential election and won 21% of the vote. So has been a major player at presidential level. She has attracted Massa over to her side. But again, it's not absolutely clear yet what benefit that has brought to her, or if that's enough to give her a clear lead over Macri. Something that's important to remember in this whole Argentine political story is the importance that Buenos Aires province plays in the electoral system. Buenos Aires province being different to Buenos Aires city. The province accounts for something like 37% of the electorate. So it's a huge mega electoral district. The other thing that's significant about the province is that it holds its gubernatorial election simultaneously with the first round of the presidential election at the end of October. However, Buenos Aires province doesn't have a second round runoff, so we will see a new governor of Buenos Aires province settled and decided in October. What that means is that whoever wins in that race, given how important the size of the electoral district is, provides huge impetus for a second round, should it be needed, of the presidential vote. And we saw that in 2015 when Macri's ally, Maria Eugenia Vidal, won the gubernatorial race in Buenos Aires province in October. Macri then needed to go on to face the runoff in November, but was buoyed and given huge momentum by that unexpected victory over the Peronists in Buenos Aires province. Buenos Aires province mirrors the national race in the sense that the major forces are all present there, and the main battle is between the incumbent governor, Maria Eugenia Vidal, who represents the governing Cambiemos coalition led by Macri. And on the other hand, you have the challenger, who is Axel Kicillof, who's well known as the former finance minister under Cristina up until 2015. He's a strong candidate. This is Cristina's stronghold. Although Vidal is popular, probably more popular than Macri himself, she faces a difficult battle in the province. At the moment, Vidal looks like she's edging it, probably by around 2 to 4% over Kicillof. But clearly it's a hugely important battle that's going on in Buenos Aires province.